Right, this is the first episode of Thorin's platform, a feature in which I will bring people on who are content creators who've made a piece that either I thought was fitting in their career, like someone they're very interested in or know a lot about, have researched, or just is interesting and topical at the moment. And what we'll do is we'll talk about the ideas but in the piece, and then if people are interested, there'll be all the links to the piece below in the description box, and you can go check those out and follow people's social media, etc., to get future pieces of work by them. So the first guest for this one is going to be Emily Rand, aka at League of Emily. It's actually not a bad name, I have to say. Over time, it's grown on me. It's not a bad little alias to have, even though you don't use it as your alias. So I think you should, but okay, it's interesting. And her piece that she did very recently was about CuVee, the top laner for Samsung Galaxy, who obviously is now actually a world champion and is a player, not only the Samsung players in general, but this is particularly a player that seems to have interested you for a long time. So let's start there. Like, when I say CuVee is now a League of Legends world champion, what do you think of that? What's the significance of that?
So when I first saw him in preseason 2015, I would not have believed. So, well, first of all, world champion. There are a lot of players that are world champions, or that, you know, maybe people would disagree or have made it to a world's final that aren't necessarily the best players in the world in their position. Because League of Legends is a team game. But I think the most surprising thing about CuVee is not only is he a world champion, but he's now considered one of the best in his position. So
yes.
If you told me that when he started in 2015 preseason, I would have been like, you're crazy, because he's bad.
Yes.
He was considered the worst player on his team. Even some of the games they won in preseason, it was because they had a mid laner that like everyone was super hyped about. His name was Bell Park on the solo queue ladder. He later became Bliss. He was a huge Fizz player.
Yes.
He was someone that everyone was watching on the ladder, and they were like, yeah, this guy. And he was actually the one that kind of headed up the team, or he was the one that when Samsung was rebuilding, because all 10 of their players from White and Blue left for China in that off season. He was the one that they were building around, and he was actually the one that contacted CuVee. And CuVee was the least impressive player on that team by pretty significant margin at times. Like, he just couldn't stand up in the 1v1. He looked really lost. He didn't know when to teleport. There was like no communication on this team because it was, you know, they'd only played for, I think, 3 or 4 days before their first preseason game together as a team. And it was just this loose collection of solo queue players, and he obviously had never played professionally before, and it was just kind of a mess. So if you want to go back and watch those games, I did for this article, and some of them are pretty entertaining, and you can see the very significant jump he has made in his play in the past few years.
So then, to frame this topic, because obviously the concept of the article now is that CuVee is at the top of the world, both figuratively in terms of the standings and in terms of, you know, he's at the peak of his career. He's perhaps, I mean, you could actually, well, I mean, maybe we'll get into this. You could perhaps make a case he was the best player on Samsung. So let's go now, skip to now, and then we'll fill in like the middle part. So if we think of right now, as you mentioned there, that is obviously something where famously that's sort of a pet peeve of mine that I have to bring up and people get annoyed by, which is when I sort of say things like, you know, player X is the worst to win a world championship, or, you know, someone else, yeah, they're a good player, but, you know, you play with, well, Faker's the obvious example I often go to. But in this particular instance, it does seem entirely integral, CuVee's role in Samsung winning this Worlds, because first of all, right, I mean, mate, you can speak to this, but there was kind of a weird element to this Worlds where on the one hand, yes, you could play all these top laners that in no sense were carry top laners. You didn't have to play carry top laners in any sense. But if you were someone who could play tanks, bruisers, and work in some element of carry top laning, clearly that put your team at an advantage. Yes, maybe not the biggest advantage in the tournament if we look at all the teams, but you look at the teams that did, and that's why people like, for example, Longzhu were highly favoured to do well at this Worlds. It felt like that was an extra kind of extra strength they had in their arsenal, you know. So what was his role in terms of as a top laner in this meta at Worlds, you know, and the significance in that respect?
I think the significance is that he is very flexible. So it basically means that in this current meta for the World Championship, a lot of focus was drawn to bot lane. And Samsung players, including CuVee, even came out and said afterwards that when they faced RNG in groups, they were like, oh, we need to attack the bot lane. Like, that's not something we'd really thought about. And so that's why you saw, like, Ruler won the series MVP for finals. A lot of bot lane attention, a lot of focus on the AD carry. And the important thing for a top laner in that kind of meta, in my opinion, is that you just really need to be flexible and you need to make sure you're not getting destroyed in the 1v1 or you're drawing pressure. And so CuVee did both. Not only did he stand up very well in the 1v1 against Tuni, but he also, when they focused him, and as SKT should have, because he was on Cho'Gath in the third game, and that's a champion that notoriously, like, we saw Huni absolutely get destroyed on Cho'Gath against Longzhu in their game 4, right? That's a champion you can attack really early. And that's exactly what SKT did. And he still was able to, like, Cho'Gath is kind of a champion where if your team manages, you scale into late game anyway. So, and that's exactly what happened to CuVee. Suddenly he was just showing up to team fights and eating other champions. So, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about the fact that he was so reliable and so consistent that they really didn't have to worry about him at all. And that allowed Ambition to do other things like cover for Crown. Like, there was a lot of focus on Crown, not necessarily even in jungle attention, but making sure that he had a strong wave clear champion. You saw the Malzahar, you saw the Galio. So it was a lot of, I think his true strength this entire tournament was the fact that Samsung could be like, okay, we can give you attention and you can carry, or we can leave you alone and we know that you're not going to get destroyed so hard that it will affect the rest of the map. So, and that was really important with other players, specifically Crown kind of underperforming at, a little bit, even through the tournament.
So to kind of relate this for people who don't watch LCK as much, I'll give a very, very kind of like broad strokes comparison. I would contrast like what you're describing here a little bit with how I think of Hauntzer in TSM, because here's the problem, right? Normally people think of top laners in the sense of like, right, well, if you were the best top laner, you probably should be camped, you know, so you can definitely get ahead in your lane and snowball it and do well from that way. But in a way, the thing I actually respect about Hauntzer is that actually most of the time he doesn't have to be camped, but it's not that he's like losing lane and you just ignore it. It's that you know he'll do all right on his own generally, and he's never going to take like massive losses out of the lane. And therefore, in theory, I mean, admittedly in their team, this is where it breaks down, but in theory, it allows the jungler to do other things, which therefore, actually, in a weird way, you are like, you're sort of absorbing pressure, but you're allowing your team to put pressure elsewhere on the map. And that is obviously quite an underrated concept in terms of the casual fan, you know, but isn't this something that kind of played into CuVee's impact on the team? Because, you know, it's not as though it was like when they had Khan, for example, on Longzhu, and people thought, right, well, the job here is just let him destroy everyone top lane and perhaps help him at times, and then, you know, the rest just take care of things until the mid game. Mm-hmm.
No, it's super important. And I mean, I think the main thing for Samsung specifically is that two things happened in addition to, like, because CuVee has been that way for a while, and him and Ambition, so the top side of the map, was the thing that even got Samsung to this point. Like, if you hadn't watched them for a while, and you'd seen them last year and you were like, okay, I know this team, I know it's Crown, I know it's Ambition, and that's actually not how the team worked at all, especially this past season. A lot of the times it was CuVee and Ambition really like stepping up and carrying this team through some of Crown's like tougher games. So I think especially in that context, it's super important that CuVee was always drawing pressure or attention or just keeping a really strong presence in the top side.
So coming into the tournament, I realized, like, here's what I'm a bit torn about with the whole Longzhu issue, is that while, yes, I absolutely agree people exaggerated how good Khan was, in as much as they made it like, right, well, he's the consensus, like, you know, only best top laner in the world, and, you know, no one else should be in that conversation. But in the context of Worlds just itself, only the teams that made it to Worlds, top lane was a pretty weak position, actually, if you look overall. Understandably so, because as I've kind of outlined in some of the past things we said, you know, it wasn't really a position that you primarily want your star player probably to be at. Hence, actually, why people like CuVee probably won Worlds. But coming into Worlds, it was pretty reasonable, I think, to say that Khan looked like the best top laner, and especially in the context that just in lane and when playing carry champions, he looked fantastic. So what was CuVee's impact in the series against Longzhu, where obviously they just swept them outright?
So CuVee actually, going into this tournament, I was really surprised at how many people said that CuVee was just going to get dumpstered in lane. Because actually, even in the losses that Samsung had against Longzhu in the regular season, the top side of the map was not the problem. So I think that against Longzhu, Samsung really had a strong bot lane focus. And they also, there were games where, because CuVee can stand up to Khan at a 1v1, right? So what Longzhu wants to do is they definitely want to focus attention topside. And the way they do that is they have, in my opinion, still the best bot lane at the tournament in Prey and Gorilla. And so because Prey and Gorilla are so dominant on the bot side, that allows Longzhu to funnel resources into Khan. And then once he has those resources, he's kind of like how Someday was when he was the star of KT, where like as soon as you give him a lead, he's gone, right? Like he's off. And he just goes and he destroys people. And they set him up to split push and they set up a 4-1 and it's like fantastic. And against Samsung, like I said, they have been really upfront about talking to how they played against RNG, how they scrimmed against RNG, and they were like, oh, like attacking the bot side is a really good idea. And that worked really well against Longzhu because it didn't allow them to give Khan the same attention. And another kind of issue with Longzhu that I highlighted, I think, on the video that we did going into Worlds, is that Cuz is not the best jungler. And maybe he'll improve in the future. I think he has a lot of potential, but he's just really young. He's rookie. He doesn't have a lot of experience. He doesn't necessarily know how to react to certain situations like a lot of veteran junglers would. Like even Ambition, you see him kind of instinctively moving around the map and reacting to things that are going on. And you'll notice a lot of veteran players are like that just because they have so many patterns to draw on, right? Like a lot of League is pattern recognition. And Cuz just doesn't have that. So when stuff like this happens, he's not necessarily going to know where to leverage the strengths on the map to balance out where the other team is attacking. And I think the fact that Core JJ and Ruler stepped up a lot, and the fact that they were able to attack the bottom side of the map was super important. And so when that happened, Khan, without the same resources, wasn't able to stand up to CuVee in the same way because CuVee is not going to buckle to Khan under pressure. He's actually beat him in the 1v1 a few times in the regular season. So I wasn't really surprised to see that happened. But I think it's a symptom of how they attacked Longzhu, which didn't allow Longzhu to execute the game plan that they wanted to.
So as you referenced earlier, part of the genesis of what became this squad, even though barely anyone except CuVee basically stuck around, was when they lost all the players from the Samsung organization over to LPL. They had a situation where they just recruited a bunch of basically rookies, like challenger type players, etc. And it looked actually as though, I mean, you have to remember logically, another reason why they lost those players wasn't just that the players wanted to leave, but supposedly Samsung at the time was actually quite cheap in contrast even to the other Korean orgs. So that was even the logic people had around making this squad, was like, right, well, this is what happens when you have a budget, a small budget for a team, you end up with a small budget team, you know, so it was logical. But obviously in that squad, very few players survived. Like, his jungler at the time was the player Eve, who just basically has never been heard from since. And obviously the team was pretty bad initially. How did bringing over Ambition as a jungler in Season 6, did that have anything to do with CuVee's rise? Did they synergize particularly well?
Yeah, I think that was super important. Two things happened on Samsung in 2016 that were really important. One is that Ambition came to the team and he just brought like every single player on Samsung at the time was like, yes, like Ambition taught us just like basic macro and communication that they didn't have. Like if you looked at Samsung and you looked at their victories, you'd see that in 2015, you'd see that sometimes they would pull off like a good team fight, or they'd have evolved enough that CuVee would get like one good flank or something, and they'd be able to pull out a victory. And what ended up happening in 2015 summer was that they actually played a lot of games. It was like them and Anarchy that were these kind of middle to bottom tier teams that were taking, like they'd at least take one game. Right? Yeah, like they'd have a few upsets. They'd take one game against the top tier team, and then the top tier team would just come back and destroy them. And so you had like these weird flashes of like individual outplays, but no strong cohesion, nothing you could say that would point to like a team identity. And that's what Ambition brought, like on all levels, in out of game and in game, just communication, leadership, kind of like he's known for being a very like kind of strict disciplinarian, which is good to have for younger players, especially in a Korean culture where that kind of thing just naturally sorts itself out. And so Ambition did a lot for CuVee in terms of just instructing him. Like, you noticed his teleports magically improved, and like early on in that season against, I think, Jinair, there's a it's hilarious to me. I don't know how many other people find this funny, but basically the OGN Observer was trolling CuVee because there was a point where he maybe should have joined up with his team, and he's just like not paying attention, kind of farming waves on Sandra. And that was kind of like a cheeky way of pointing out, like, maybe you should teleport, maybe you should do this. And you noticed after that, like, he slowly improved in terms of flanking, teleporting, ward placement, like all this minute stuff that maybe not a lot of people pay attention to in terms of the progression of a player, but was just super important. And then in addition to that, again, just with experience, he became better at trading in lane, working with his jungler who was Ambition. And the other thing that happened, I'm writing a separate piece about this, but the other thing that happened was Ambition learned how to be a jungler, because when he was on CJ, he wasn't really a great jungler. He was a fine player, but he was not a good jungler. And because of Wraith, he and Wraith initially worked very, very well together. And because of the way Wraith roamed and set up vision control, it really allowed Ambition to improve a lot of his pathing and do a lot more as an actual jungler instead of just kind of farming and team fighting. But in terms of CuVee, that's what Ambition brought. And it was actually super important because a lot of those things, again, he'd have these he improved as a player individually to the point where he'd have some interesting or really smart plays, but then it didn't add up into anything that contributed to the team until Ambition arrived.
And did their experiments where they kept trying to work Haru into the lineup this year, is that part of what made CuVee not as highly rated?
I think
because it cost them a bunch of games, right?
Primarily only in summer a few times when Haru played. I think the important thing to note about Haru isn't necessarily on CuVee's side, because CuVee, when Haru played, he would be a little bit more on his own, because Haru really relied on having strong pushing lanes so that he had a lot of really aggressive invades early.
Sure.
And that's why a lot of people are pointing to him during spring, and they were like, oh man, Haru is so good.
Yes.
He's great. He's a lot more he provides more pressure than Ambition. He is a lot more aggressive. This is awesome. It's kind of a natural evolution of Samsung. And then you saw when Crown specifically really started to struggle in the mid lane, that was the huge issue with Haru. I think it actually, in some of those games, it showcased CuVee's carry prowess even more, because he'd have to do more work sometimes in both team fights and then in the 1v1 just to try to get an advantage, because if you don't have a pushing mid lane and Haru is still doing these crazy risky invades without minion control and without vision control, he dies. So he loses pressure. And then additionally, without ambition on the map and without those early leads, a lot of their Baron setups and their neutral objective setups were really bad. So you see, like, in the one game that Haru played at Worlds, where they have pushing waves and they're fine early, and they're doing really well against Fenerbahce, and then they just make a ton of miscommunication mid game. So I think with Haru during the regular season, it was sometimes easier to see CuVee's like 1v1 carry potential just because of that. But there was a very visible communication breakdown when it came to mid game, especially if they didn't have a lot of mid control from Crown when Haru played.
Okay, so at last year's Worlds, where obviously Samsung made the final as well, and we're actually a game from winning the title, it was a very different environment for CuVee though, because first of all, in contrast to what I set up before, that Worlds had a number of very strong top lanes. Obviously, it had Smeb from Rocks, and then you had a bunch of people who also had quite highly rated, but from the Western teams, like Odoamne. Impact at the time was considered better than he is now, you know. You had a whole bunch of players who were obviously very good players. Even Duke came in with a better reputation this year than Huni did on SK Telecom. But at the same time, that was kind of the breakout for CuVee. A lot of people really noticed him at this Worlds, despite the fact at the time, you know, the best player on his team was thought far and away to be Crown, because he's the one who really came in with the hype of, you know, this guy might actually be able to contend with Faker. So how do you contrast CuVee at Season 6 Worlds to the CuVee of Season 7 Worlds?
I think he's actually still improved a lot from then. It's all in, like, minute stuff that, again, like, it's like lane trading and when to push a wave and teleport timing and stuff like that. But I think because he's had to shoulder a bit more of the burden this year, I also think that has allowed him to improve a lot, because in spring, Crown was doing well, but then Ruler was, his champion pool was kind of suspect. That's where KT famously targeted him and like absolutely just destroyed the bottom lane so hard that they swapped in Stitch, I believe, for the third game. And I think this year there's always been kind of a weak point on the map that you could spot out and be like, okay, you know, CuVee and Ambition have had to kind of cover for this specific thing. And so I think any time that you have something like that going on a team, and a player has evolved enough that they can compensate for it, I think it really shows. So even more so than last year's World Championship, I think CuVee has really evolved into this multi-dimensional player that can kind of play almost any play style and be successful on this team. So I think a lot of that has to do with just the larger role that he had to take on the team this year when some of the other components on the map were struggling.
In your piece, when you look at some of the quotes from him, when you consider he's just won the biggest tournament basically you can ever win in League of Legends, and, you know, as a starring player, they're actually, I mean, I realize people will think the context of Korean players is, you know, they're quite understated, etc. Yeah, as like general personalities, but in these sorts of instances, this is where actually it's permitted in Korean culture to be like, okay, I won, you know, because I had the best performance and maybe I'm the best player at my position now. But even when he won, it seems like he's still fairly understated, or he makes it clear that that's not his mindset, you know, which I guess plays into his playing style, right? Because it's not like if he's now the best, they're going to switch everything and he's going to get all the resources, right? So what would you say about his kind of mindset?
He's really interesting because he, the whole reason why he even, like, he doesn't have, you know how other people have these like really dramatic backstories where it's like, yes, I wanted to be a League of Legends player, or like Crown. I actually first talked to Crown when he was in Brazil, right before he left. And he's just this player who's known for, you know, just like really being super into it. Like you have to pry him out of his chair or else he's going to get sick just from playing so many games. And CuVee is not that kind of player, and he got into it because he scored poorly on his tests, and that happened to be the time when he was queuing up for a league game, and Bliss was like, hey, do you want to be a part of my team? Because he'd received offers before just as a high solo queue player. They never accepted them because he's like, yeah, I'm just going to go to college. And he talking to him in person, he's very unassuming. He's very affable. He's very cheery. He's often like, even after a loss, he's kind of that person who has a very, I don't even want to say like a bubbly personality because it's not that, but he's very calm, very like nice. I know like that's actually a terrible adjective because it doesn't really say much, but like he's just always he's a very positive, upbeat person. And it's very odd to write about a player like him because it's not that he doesn't have the fire or passion for League of Legends, because he definitely does. And he's even said that playing the game more has actually like increased his competitive nature. But because he's so affable, especially in interviews, I think a lot of people underestimate how much he really loves the game and just really loves playing. And he's someone that thoroughly enjoys what he does. And it comes out in interviews and like just his general like positivity, I guess. But in comparison to someone like, you know, Ambition with this long story career, and Crown, who's like very intense, I think he kind of flies under the radar a lot of the times because of his personality, you know, because he's not Smeb, who like has, again, like very bubbly, very outgoing. Yes. He'll talk to anyone. Like when I was in Korea talking to Smeb and I didn't speak Korean, he immediately just started talking in English. And he's one of those people who will get better at languages just because he has a very outgoing personality, loves to talk to people. And CuVee doesn't draw attention to himself ever. And even to your point, when in the post-game press conference, he was like, I don't really care about being the best top laner in the world, but I do care about being on the best team. And that kind of sums up his personality in a nutshell. But I also think it's one of the reasons why a lot of people have overlooked him as a player, because he's not going to be he's not going to be Khan, right? Who's like calling out Huni and Untara in the pregame trash talk thread. Like that's not really going to be CuVee. So, I think that's actually one of the reasons why a lot of people have overlooked him in the past, is because when he does well, he's not really the kind of person who will draw attention to himself or talk about his success.
So at the end of the article, okay, something that you don't reference as a topic, and this is going to be my last question, is you end on a line that's very well phrased. You say that he's one of the best top laners in the world and now a world champion. So listen, in line with his personality, that's all you need, right? You're just one of the best players and you're a world champion. So, you know, who cares? You don't need the debate anymore. But I have to ask you, when I read this piece, it sounds to me like, obviously, by the way, there's an entire discussion that would last many hours of how do we define the best player at a role, and, you know, do you have to be the star player? What, you know, that's a whole separate topic we're not going to get into. But when I read this piece, the feeling I get is, right, okay, Smeb has kind of the name value. He's got the name value to be the best player. And, you know, at times when they win, it looks like, right, everything worked out for him. And if he loses, you know, there's a lot of other problems in Samsung as well. People don't, in KT rather, people won't necessarily blame him entirely. As you said before, when you talk about Khan, yes, clearly very good in his own, I won't say one-dimensional way, but his own narrow field. He's fantastic at what he does, but has a lot of resources. It sounds like, even though you don't say it at the end of the article, you think CuVee is the best top player in the world.
I actually, yeah. So, this is a really interesting discussion because the other day I posted my All-Stars. If I could vote in Korean All-Stars, which I can't, obviously, because I have a North American account. But I did rank Smeb higher than CuVee. Okay. I picked him as my top laner, even though currently I believe CuVee and Ambition are the two players from Samsung that are like winning by a significant margin because of their Worlds performance. I think so. In terms of, and this gets into like what's an all-star, what's the best. I would say that right now, based on his performance in summer, so LCK summer, and currently, I said he was the best top laner coming into the event, and I think he's the current best top laner in the world. However, the reason why I would vote Smeb over CuVee in the All-Stars is because I think that Smeb had to do a little bit more heavy lifting in terms of his team, because KT had, maybe it's just because I am very harsh on KT, because they're the one team that I actually like have an emotional investment in, so I rip them apart a lot more. But they had a lot of miscommunication on that team. And there were a lot of times where Smeb and Score were kind of dragging that team up, and it wasn't as visible as CuVee's carry performances. But I think Smeb did a lot for that team that should be recognized in an all-star capacity.
Okay, and obviously Emily's article that we've been referring to and that's framed this discussion, it's entitled CuVee Seong-jin is smiling all the way to the top. It's on ESPN and it'll be in the description box below.
I'm Kelsey Moser and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel where no sandbagging goes unscrutinized.